Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a carefully organized board game. Everything in his life was precisely arranged, from his Italian leather shoes to the way his coffee was served each morning at exactly 7:15. At 52, he had built an empire that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Wellington Industries owned half the commercial real estate in the downtown district, and Marcus owned Wellington Industries with an iron fist wrapped in expensive silk gloves. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, displaying a photo of his 8-year-old son, David. The boy had his mother's gentle eyes and Marcus's determined chin, though Marcus often worried the gentleness might prove problematic in the business world David would one day inherit. The call was from Beatrice Thompson, the caregiver he had hired 6 months ago to look after David during his after-school hours and weekends when Marcus was traveling or working late. Beatrice was a 60-year-old black woman from the south side of town who had come highly recommended by the exclusive agency Marcus used for all his domestic staff. She had raised 4 children of her own, all of whom had gone on to successful careers, and her references painted her as patient, dedicated, and completely trustworthy. Marcus had been initially hesitant about hiring someone from such a different background from his own privileged upbringing, but his assistant had assured him that Beatrice's qualifications were impeccable. The Wellington mansion sat in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns that looked like they belonged in a magazine. David lived there with Marcus during the weeks he wasn't with his ex-wife, Catherine, who had moved to Paris after their divorce 2 years earlier. The custody arrangement was complicated but civilized, much like everything else in Marcus's carefully controlled existence. David was a quiet, thoughtful child who seemed more interested in books and nature documentaries than the business empire he would someday inherit. This worried Marcus, who remembered being driven and ambitious even as a young boy. He had hoped that hiring Beatrice would help instill some discipline and structure in David's daily routine, preparing him for the responsibilities that came with the Wellington name. Beatrice had seemed perfect for the job during the interview process. She spoke eloquently about child development and education, demonstrating a deep understanding of how to nurture a young mind while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She had experience with wealthy families and understood the expectations that came with working in such an environment. Marcus had been particularly impressed by her calm demeanor and the way she spoke about children as individuals rather than just charges to be managed. The first few months of Beatrice's employment had gone smoothly. David seemed to enjoy her company, often chatting excitedly about the stories she would tell him or the games they would play together. Marcus appreciated that his son was happy and well cared for, though he sometimes worried that Beatrice was perhaps too lenient with the boy. He had grown up with strict nannies who emphasized proper behavior and academic achievement above all else. Marcus's own childhood had been a series of lessons in excellence and perfectionism. His father, Harold Wellington, had been even more demanding than Marcus was now, expecting nothing less than perfection in every aspect of life. Harold had built the family fortune through ruthless business practices and unwavering attention to detail, and he had raised Marcus to understand that the Wellington name carried weight and responsibility that could never be taken lightly. The pressure to maintain the family legacy was something Marcus felt every day. He worked 16-hour days not just because he loved the challenge, but because he knew that any sign of weakness or failure would reflect poorly on generations of Wellington's success. This drive for perfection extended to every aspect of his life, including how his son was raised and presented to the world. David attended the most prestigious private school in the city, where tuition cost more than most people made in a year. Marcus had donated generously to ensure his son received the best possible education and would be positioned for success in whatever field he chose to pursue. Though secretly, Marcus hoped David would choose to join the family business and continue the Wellington tradition of commercial excellence. The divorce from Catherine had been particularly difficult because it disrupted the perfect image Marcus had worked so hard to create. Catherine had grown tired of the constant pressure to be the ideal corporate wife, attending charity galas and dinner parties where everything was about maintaining appearances rather than genuine connection. She had wanted a simpler life, more time with David, and less emphasis on status and wealth. Marcus had tried to understand her perspective, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was being ungrateful for the opportunities and security his success provided. He had worked tirelessly to build a life that most people could only dream of, and her decision to walk away from it felt like a rejection of everything he valued. The fact that she had taken David with her to Paris for half the year only added to his sense of loss and failure. Since the divorce, Marcus had thrown himself even deeper into his work, using business success as a way to prove to himself and others that he was still in control of his life. He had become more demanding of his employees, more critical of any mistakes or inefficiencies, and more focused on maintaining the perfect image that he believed was essential to his professional reputation. When David was with him, Marcus tried to be the kind of father he thought was appropriate for a Wellington heir. He enrolled the boy in tennis lessons, piano lessons, and tutoring sessions designed to give him every possible advantage. He made sure David understood the importance of proper behavior, good grades, and representing the family name with dignity and respect. Sometimes Marcus wondered if he was being too hard on David, especially when he saw the boy's wistful expressions during their formal dinner conversations or structured activity sessions. But, then, he would remember his own childhood and how his father's high expectations had ultimately led to his success, and he would push aside any doubts about his parenting approach. Beatrice had seemed to understand this balance between nurture and discipline, at least initially. She would help David with his homework but also make sure he understood the importance of excellence. She would play games with him but also teach him about responsibility and proper behavior. Marcus had been pleased with this approach and had even begun to relax slightly about the arrangement. The problems began subtly, with small things that Marcus initially chose to overlook. David would come home from afternoons with Beatrice with grass stains on his clothes or dirt under his fingernails. His hair would be slightly messy, and sometimes he smelled like outdoors rather than the carefully climate-controlled environment Marcus preferred. These details bothered Marcus more than he cared to admit, but he told himself they were minor issues that could be addressed. Marcus had specific expectations about how David should look and behave, especially when there was any possibility that neighbors or business associates might see him. The Wellington estate was often visited by important people, and Marcus needed to know that David would always present himself appropriately. A dirty or disheveled child reflected poorly on the family's standards and attention to detail. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to notice that David seemed different somehow. The boy was more animated during dinner conversations, often talking excitedly about things he had done with Beatrice that Marcus didn't quite understand. David would mention exploring the garden, building something with sticks, or learning about insects, and these activities seemed completely foreign to the structured, educational experiences Marcus thought were more appropriate. The breaking point came on a particularly important day when Marcus was expecting a visit from potential business partners who were considering a major real estate deal with Wellington Industries. These were serious, conservative men who value tradition and proper presentation above all else. Marcus had planned to introduce David briefly as a way of demonstrating his family values and stability. When Marcus arrived home that afternoon, he found David in the backyard with Beatrice, both of them covered in mud and dirt from what appeared to be some kind of outdoor project. David's expensive clothes were ruined, his face was smeared with soil, and his hair was standing up in all directions. Beatrice was kneeling beside him, equally dirty, helping him dig what looked like a small hole near the garden. The sight filled Marcus with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. All he could think about was what his business partners would think if they saw David in such a condition. All the careful planning and image management would be destroyed by this moment of carelessness and inappropriate supervision. How could Beatrice not understand that David needed to be presentable at all times? Marcus stormed across the lawn, his expensive shoes sinking into the soft earth as he approached them. David looked up with a bright smile, clearly excited to share whatever project they had been working on, but Marcus was too angry to listen. All he could see was the dirt, the mess, and the complete disregard for the standards he had so carefully established. "What is going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "David, look at yourself. You're absolutely filthy. This is completely unacceptable." Beatrice slowly stood up, wiping her hands on her already dirty apron. Her expression was calm, but Marcus could see something flicker in her eyes that might have been disappointment or sadness. David's smile faded as he looked between his father and his caregiver, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. We were just working on a special project, Beatrice said quietly, her voice maintaining its usual gentle tone despite Marcus's obvious anger. David was very excited about it, and I thought it would be educational. Educational? Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. Getting my son covered in mud is educational? These clothes cost more than most people make in a week, and you've completely ruined them. Not to mention how he looks. I have important business associates coming to the house this evening, and my son looks like he's been playing in a construction site. David stepped closer to Beatrice, instinctively seeking protection from his father's anger. This small gesture only made Marcus more furious, as it seemed to highlight how Beatrice had undermined his authority and created an inappropriate bond with his child. The boy should be looking to him for guidance and protection, not to the hired help who had so clearly failed in her basic responsibilities. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world cracking around the edges as he stared at his mud-covered son. Every business principle he had ever learned screamed that this situation was completely out of control. In the corporate world, when someone failed to meet expectations this dramatically, there were consequences. The same rules had to apply to his personal life, or nothing would maintain the standards he had worked so hard to establish. David, go inside immediately and get cleaned up, Marcus ordered, his voice carrying the same authority he used in board meetings. Mrs. Henderson will help you get properly dressed. I need to speak with Miss Thompson privately. David looked confused and hurt, his small hands still clutching what appeared to be a small seedling they had been planting. But, Dad, we were making something special for you. Miss B said it would grow into something beautiful and you would really like it. We were almost finished. The innocence in David's voice only made Marcus more frustrated. The boy clearly didn't understand the importance of proper presentation and appropriate behavior. This was exactly the kind of problem Marcus had been afraid would develop if David wasn't given proper guidance and structure. Beatrice had obviously been filling the child's head with inappropriate ideas about what was acceptable. Now, David, Marcus said firmly, using the tone that had made grown men change their minds about million-dollar deals. We'll discuss this later. Go inside and clean yourself up properly. David's lower lip trembled slightly, but he dropped the seedling and walked toward the house, his small shoulders sagging with disappointment. Marcus watched him go, feeling a brief pang of guilt that he quickly pushed aside. Sometimes being a good father meant making difficult decisions that children couldn't understand. David would thank him later when he was successful and respected instead of someone who thought it was acceptable to look like a vagrant. Once David was inside, Marcus turned his full attention to Beatrice. She had picked up the dropped seedling and was holding it carefully in her dirt-stained hands, her expression unreadable. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone who was completely comfortable with the situation, which only made Marcus more angry. She should be apologetic and embarrassed by her failure to maintain appropriate standards. Miss Thompson, I am extremely disappointed in your judgment today, Marcus began, falling into the professional tone he used when firing employees. When I hired you, I made it very clear that David's appearance and behavior needed to reflect the standards of this family. What I found today is completely unacceptable. Beatrice listened without interrupting, her dark eyes fixed on Marcus's face with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. There was something in her expression that reminded him of his grandmother, who had always been able to see through his childhood excuses and deflections with embarrassing accuracy. But Beatrice was an employee, not a family member, and she had no right to judge his decisions or expectations. I understand you're upset, Beatrice said carefully, still holding the small plant. But, if you would let me explain what we were doing, I think you might see the situation differently. David wasn't just playing in the dirt. He was learning something important about growth and patience and taking care of living things. Marcus shook his head impatiently. Miss Thompson, I don't think you understand the position my family holds in this community. David will someday inherit a business empire that employs thousands of people and controls millions of dollars in assets. He needs to learn discipline and proper behavior, not how to dig holes in the garden like a common laborer. The words felt harsh even as he said them, but Marcus believed they were necessary. Beatrice came from a different world where different standards applied, and she clearly didn't understand the pressures and expectations that came with the Wellington name. It wasn't her fault, exactly, but it made her unsuitable for this particular position. "I do understand the pressure that comes with responsibility," Beatrice replied quietly. "I've raised 4 children who all face their own challenges and expectations. But I also understand that children need to explore and learn and sometimes get dirty in the process. That's how they grow into confident, capable adults." Marcus felt his frustration growing. Beatrice seemed determined to argue with him instead of accepting that she had made a mistake. This was exactly the kind of insubordination that he would never tolerate from any employee, regardless of how well-intentioned they might be. The fact that she was discussing his parenting decisions as if she had any authority in the matter was particularly galling. "Miss Thompson, I appreciate your perspective, but I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what I expect from David's caregiver," Marcus said, his voice becoming colder and more formal. "I need someone who understands that presentation and proper behavior are not negotiable. Someone who will help David develop the discipline and standards he'll need to succeed in life." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from Marcus's face to the house where David had disappeared. When she spoke again, her voice was sad but not apologetic. "Mr. Wellington, I've been taking care of children for 40 years. I've seen what happens when young people are taught that appearance matters more than character, that perfection is more important than compassion. David is a wonderful, curious, intelligent boy who needs room to grow and explore." The implied criticism in her words made Marcus's anger flare again. How dare she suggest that his expectations for his son were somehow harmful or misguided? Marcus had been raised with high standards and strict expectations, and he had achieved more success than most people could imagine. The same approach would work for David if it was applied consistently and properly. "I think we have very different ideas about what children need," Marcus said coldly. "David needs structure, discipline, and guidance that will prepare him for the real world. He doesn't need to be encouraged to act like a common child with no understanding of proper behavior or family responsibility." As soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus realized how they sounded. He had essentially called Beatrice common, which wasn't exactly what he had meant to say. But he was too angry and frustrated to take it back or soften the statement. The bottom line was that Beatrice had failed to meet his expectations, and there needed to be consequences. Beatrice's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She carefully placed the seedling on a nearby garden table and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I see," she said simply. "I think I understand the situation now." "Good," Marcus said, though he felt oddly unsatisfied by her response. He had expected more of an argument or at least some attempt to defend her actions. Her calm acceptance somehow made him feel worse about the entire confrontation. "I'll have my assistant prepare your final payment and a reference letter. You can finish out the week if you'd like, but I'll be making other arrangements for David's care." Beatrice nodded slowly, her eyes moving once more toward the house. "What about David? He's been looking forward to showing you the garden project we've been working on. He wanted it to be a surprise for when you got back from your next business trip." The mention of a surprise project caught Marcus off guard. David had been excited about something for the past few weeks, mentioning that he was working on something special with Miss B, but Marcus had been too busy to pay much attention. He had assumed it was just some childish craft project that would be forgotten in a few days. "What kind of project?" Marcus asked, despite himself. Beatrice hesitated, as if she was deciding whether to explain or simply let it go. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward a corner of the garden that Marcus rarely paid attention to. David noticed that this section gets beautiful morning sunlight, and he wanted to plant a memorial garden for his mother's favorite flowers. He's been researching what kinds of plants would grow best here and planning the layout very carefully. Marcus felt a strange tightness in his chest. Catherine had loved gardening when they were married, often spending hours working with the plants around their previous home. David had inherited her love of growing things, though Marcus had never paid much attention to this interest. After the divorce, David rarely mentioned his mother's hobbies or the things they had shared together. He wanted it to be ready for Mother's Day so he could send her pictures, Beatrice continued. We've been working on it every day after his homework and piano practice. Today we were planting the last of the seedlings he picked out especially for her. The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. David had been working for weeks on a thoughtful, meaningful project that demonstrated exactly the kind of planning and dedication Marcus claimed to value. The boy had been showing initiative, creativity, and genuine care for someone important to him. And Marcus had just destroyed it because he was worried about appearances. Marcus looked toward the garden corner Beatrice had indicated and realized that what he had dismissed as random digging was actually a carefully planned space with small markers indicating where different plants would go. There were neat rows and thoughtful spacing that showed real planning and consideration. David had been applying the same attention to detail that Marcus prized in business to a personal project that would bring joy to his mother. "Why didn't you tell me about this project?" Marcus asked, though he knew the answer even as he spoke. He had made it clear that he was too busy for detailed reports about David's daily activities. He had trusted Beatrice to handle everything appropriately and had only paid attention when something went wrong. David wanted it to be a surprise, Beatrice said simply. He was so proud of the planning he had done and the research he had put into choosing the right plants. He wanted to show you the finished garden and explain how he had designed everything. Today was supposed to be the completion day. Marcus felt the familiar weight of guilt and regret that he associated with his failures as a father. Once again, he had missed something important about his son's inner life because he had been focused on surface appearances rather than underlying substance. David had been demonstrating exactly the kind of thoughtful planning and attention to detail that Marcus claimed to want to teach him, but Marcus had been too concerned with keeping the boy clean to notice. The irony was not lost on him. He had fired Beatrice for allowing David to get dirty while doing something that showed initiative, creativity, and genuine care. Meanwhile, Marcus's obsession with appearance had caused him to miss seeing the very qualities he most wanted to develop in his son. David had been learning patience, planning, and dedication, but Marcus had only seen mud and ruined clothes. "I'm afraid the damage is done now," Beatrice said gently, looking at the scattered gardening tools and the disrupted planting area. David was so excited to show you what he had accomplished. He's been counting down the days until the project was finished. Marcus realized that his angry outburst had done more than just embarrass him in front of Beatrice. He had also broken something precious for David, destroying weeks of careful work and excited anticipation. The boy had been planning a surprise that combined thoughtfulness, hard work, and genuine love, and Marcus had crushed it because he was worried about what some business associates might think. Standing there in his expensive suit, looking at the evidence of his son's destroyed project, Marcus felt more out of place than he ever had in any boardroom negotiation. He had built his life around being right, being in control, and maintaining standards. But, in this moment, he could see that his standards had blinded him to something much more valuable than perfect appearances. The sound of a car in the driveway reminded Marcus that his business meeting was still scheduled to happen. Important men were coming to discuss important deals, and he needed to focus on maintaining the professional image that kept his empire running smoothly. But, for the first time in years, Marcus found himself wondering if the cost of that image was higher than he had been willing to acknowledge. The business meeting that evening was a complete disaster, though not for the reasons Marcus had anticipated. His potential partners arrived exactly on time, 3 distinguished men in perfectly pressed suits who represented old money and traditional values. Marcus had prepared extensively for this negotiation, knowing that their investment could expand Wellington Industries into new markets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. David appeared briefly during cocktails, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that made him look like a miniature businessman. Mrs. Henderson had done her usual efficient job of making sure every detail was perfect, from his polished shoes to his carefully combed hair. The boy shook hands politely with each guest and answered their questions about school and future plans with the kind of rehearsed responses Marcus had taught him for such occasions. But something was wrong. David's usual bright energy was completely absent, replaced by a mechanical politeness that made him seem like a well-programmed robot rather than a living child. He answered questions correctly but without enthusiasm, smiled when appropriate but without warmth, and excused himself at the proper time without showing any personality whatsoever. The guests noticed the difference, commenting quietly among themselves about how serious and adult-like the boy seemed. Marcus should have been proud. David was presenting exactly the image of controlled excellence that Marcus believed was essential for the Wellington reputation. But, instead of satisfaction, Marcus felt a growing sense of unease as he watched his son perform like a trained actor rather than simply being himself. The animated, excited child who had been working in the garden just hours earlier had been replaced by this hollow version who hit every mark but conveyed no genuine spirit. During dinner, Marcus found his attention drifting from the business discussion to thoughts about what Beatrice had told him. The Memorial Garden project represented exactly the kind of initiative and thoughtful planning that Marcus claimed to value in his professional life. David had identified a goal, researched solutions, created a timeline, and executed a complex plan over several weeks. These were advanced planning skills that many adults struggled with, yet Marcus had dismissed them because they involved getting dirty. The conversation around the dinner table focused on market trends and investment opportunities, topics that usually energized Marcus and brought out his most persuasive arguments. But, tonight, he kept thinking about the look of disappointment and confusion on David's face when Marcus had ordered him inside. The boy had been trying to share something important, something he had worked hard to create, and Marcus had rejected it without even listening to the explanation. One of his guests, Robert Ashworth, was telling a story about his own grandson's recent piano recital. The pride in the older man's voice was evident as he described the boy's performance and the months of practice that had led to that moment. Robert's eyes lit up as he talked about spending time with the child and watching him develop his talents through patient dedication. "There's nothing quite like seeing a young person discover their own capabilities," Robert was saying. "My grandson has been working on this particular piece for 6 months, and watching him master each difficult section has been remarkable. Children have such incredible focus and determination when they're pursuing something they care about." Marcus nodded and made appropriate comments, but privately he was wondering when he had last felt that kind of pride and excitement about David's accomplishments. Most of his interactions with his son focused on correcting behavior or ensuring proper performance rather than celebrating genuine achievements or interests. When was the last time David had shown him something he was excited about, rather than something he was required to do? The business discussion continued through multiple courses, covering financial projections and market analyses that would normally hold Marcus's complete attention. But he found himself distracted by questions about his relationship with David and his expectations for their interactions. Had he become so focused on molding David into the perfect heir that he had forgotten to actually know his son as an individual person? After the guests left, expressing polite interest in moving forward with the investment discussions, Marcus felt oddly deflated rather than energized by the successful evening. The meeting had gone well from a business perspective, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing from his life. The contrast between Robert Ashworth's obvious joy in his grandson's achievements and Marcus's mechanical satisfaction with David's proper behavior was troubling. Marcus found himself walking through the house, ending up in David's room where the boy was already asleep. In the dim light from the hallway, David looked younger and more vulnerable than he did during their formal interactions. His face was peaceful and relaxed, free from the careful control he maintained during waking hours when his father was around. On David's desk, Marcus noticed a notebook filled with careful drawings and notes about different types of flowers and plants. The handwriting was neat and methodical, showing the same attention to detail that Marcus prized in his business documents. David had researched growing seasons, soil requirements, and care instructions with the thoroughness of a professional gardener. This was serious work, not childish play. Marcus picked up the notebook and flipped through pages of botanical drawings, planting schedules, and careful notes about his mother's favorite flowers. David had even included cost calculations for the plants and materials, showing that he understood the financial aspects of the project. The level of planning and consideration was impressive by any standard, yet Marcus had dismissed it entirely because it involved getting dirty. One page contained a letter David had apparently been writing to his mother, describing the garden project and his excitement about creating something beautiful for her. The boy's love for Catherine was evident in every carefully chosen word, and his pride in the work he was doing came through clearly in his descriptions of the planning and planting process. Marcus felt a stab of jealousy that David never wrote about him with such obvious affection and enthusiasm. The next morning, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine. His coffee tasted different, his morning reports seemed less important, and the view from his office window looked somehow changed. The city below still sprawled in its organized patterns, but Marcus found himself thinking about gardens and growth rather than buildings and business deals. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He called his assistant and canceled his morning meetings, then drove home to talk with David about the garden project. He needed to understand what had really happened the previous afternoon and why it had affected him so strongly. David was in the kitchen with Mrs. Henderson, mechanically eating breakfast while reading a book about business management that Marcus had given him. The boy looked up when his father entered, his expression cautious and guarded in a way that made Marcus's heart ache. When had David learned to be wary of his presence instead of excited to see him? "Good morning, David," Marcus said, sitting down across from his son at the kitchen table. "I was hoping we could talk about the project you were working on yesterday with Miss Thompson." David's face went through several expressions before settling on careful neutrality. "It's okay, Dad. I understand why you were upset. I shouldn't have gotten so dirty when you had important people coming over. I'm sorry I embarrassed you." The formal apology hit Marcus harder than any angry outburst could have. David was accepting blame for something that wasn't his fault, taking responsibility for his father's reaction rather than defending his own actions. This was exactly the kind of people-pleasing behavior that Marcus recognized from his own childhood, and he realized with growing horror that he was recreating the same dynamics that had made his own relationship with his father so complicated. "David, you didn't embarrass me," Marcus said carefully. "I was wrong to react the way I did without understanding what you were doing. Can you tell me about the garden project? I'd like to hear about your planning and research." David's eyes widened with surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe his father was genuinely interested. Slowly, cautiously, he began to explain the memorial garden concept and the weeks of preparation that had gone into selecting the right plants and designing the layout. As he talked, his voice gained enthusiasm and his face lit up with the same excitement Marcus had briefly seen the day before. The complexity and thoughtfulness of David's project became more apparent as he explained his reasoning for each decision. He had considered sunlight patterns, seasonal timing, color combinations, and maintenance requirements with the kind of systematic approach that Marcus used for major business decisions. David had even created backup plans for different weather scenarios and researched organic gardening methods to ensure the plants would be healthy and sustainable. "I wanted Mom to see that I could create something beautiful and take care of it properly," David explained. "She always said that gardens teach you about patience and responsibility because you have to keep caring for them even when you don't see immediate results. I thought if I could show her that I understood that lesson, she would be proud of me." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he realized the deeper meaning behind David's project. The boy wasn't just creating a memorial garden, he was trying to connect with his absent mother by demonstrating that he had internalized her values and lessons. David was using the project to show Catherine that he remembered what she had taught him and that he was growing into the kind of person she wanted him to become. The fact that Marcus had destroyed this meaningful work because he was worried about appearances felt like one of the worst mistakes he had ever made. David had been learning exactly the kinds of lessons that Marcus claimed to value: patience, planning, dedication, and follow-through, but Marcus had been too focused on surface appearances to recognize the real education that was taking place. "David, I owe you an apology," Marcus said, his voice rougher than usual. "I should have listened to your explanation before I reacted. Your garden project sounds like exactly the kind of thoughtful work that I should be proud of, not angry about." David looked confused by this unexpected response. "But I was really dirty, and your business friends were coming. Miss B said we should have been more careful about the timing, but I wanted to finish the planting before the weekend because the weather was supposed to be perfect." Marcus realized that Beatrice had probably been trying to manage the situation appropriately, but David's excitement about completing his project had overridden practical considerations about timing. This was exactly the kind of passion and dedication that Marcus should be encouraging, not discouraging. The fact that his son cared more about doing good work than about staying clean should have been seen as a positive character trait. Tell me more about Miss Thompson's involvement in this project, Marcus said, genuinely curious about Beatrice's role in helping David develop such an ambitious plan. David's face brightened further as he described how Beatrice had helped him research different plants and taught him about proper gardening techniques. She had encouraged his initiative while providing guidance and expertise that helped him make informed decisions. Rather than doing the work for him, she had taught him to do the research and planning himself, stepping in only when he needed adult assistance with heavy lifting or complex concepts. Miss B said that the best way to honor someone you love is to learn from them and carry their lessons forward in your own life, David explained. She helped me understand that Mom's love of gardening wasn't just about pretty flowers, but about patience and nurturing and taking care of living things. That's why I wanted to create something that would grow and be beautiful for a long time. Marcus felt a growing sense of regret about his hasty decision to fire Beatrice. She had clearly been providing exactly the kind of thoughtful guidance that David needed, helping him develop meaningful projects while learning important life skills. Her approach combined practical education with emotional support in a way that was producing remarkable results in David's development. That afternoon, Marcus did something he had never done before in his professional life. He admitted he might have made a serious mistake and decided to investigate further before the consequences became irreversible. The conversation with David had shaken his confidence in his own judgment, and he needed to understand exactly what kind of caregiver he had dismissed so hastily. Marcus called the agency that had originally recommended Beatrice, asking to speak with the director. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in our worst assumptions. What happens when a man's prejudice blinds him to an act of heroism happening right under his nose? When Marcus Wellington fired his son's caregiver for letting the boy get dirty, he thought he was protecting his family's reputation. He had no idea he was about to discover a truth that would shatter everything he believed about judgment, sacrifice, and the real meaning of care. This is the story of how one wealthy man's snap decision led to the most humbling revelation of his life, and changed not just his perspective, but his entire world.